Hey guys, welcome to the podcast. Today we take a deep dive into one of the most enduring mysteries of our time, the JFK assassination. As we approach the 60th anniversary, I have the distinct privilege of hosting a luminary in the field who has dedicated his life to unearthing the truth about what happened on November 22nd, 1963. Jefferson Morley is a distinguished veteran of Washington journalism, renowned for breaking stories on the global stage and dissecting U.S. foreign policy. Jeff has been the plaintiff in two lawsuits aimed at opening the vault of classified information surrounding the JFK assassination. One of these lawsuits is against the CIA and the other against President Biden himself. Jeff is also the author of three seminal books on Cold War espionage, including Our Men in Mexico, The Ghost, and Scorpion's Dance, each shedding light on the covert world of the CIA and its profound influence on our nation's history. In addition, he serves as the co-founder and editor of the groundbreaking JFK Facts Substack newsletter, which is worth checking out. This Substack continues to challenge conventional wisdom and uncover hidden truths about the JFK assassination. Please welcome Jeff as we look into what we knew then about the situation versus what we know now, and how the mystery behind it could shake the foundations of democracy and the U.S. government today.
Recorded live.
Hi, how are you, sir? Great. Thank you so much for joining us. I really do appreciate it. It must be a busy time for you, I guess. 60th anniversary coming up next month.
This is the season, yes. Yeah. Lots
And
of interest and lots of conversation.
and I know you've been studying this for many years. So how does this compare to the 50th anniversary? Is this build up even greater now, or?
The 50th anniversary was a really big deal, and I think this is not quite the same, but there is a new, it's pretty strong. It's pretty strong, and there's, because of the continuing secrecy, the media interest is still strong because the secrecy is so hard to explain, and suspicious, frankly, and people feel that. So I think that's the difference between the 50th and the 60th is there's a feeling of what's going on here now.
Absolutely, yeah. It seems to be. I mean, because I think when they said they're going to release them, everyone was like, "Okay, well, maybe it's all going to come out." And then they're saying we still have whatever it is, 5,000 documents still to go.
Yeah.
Because you were involved in the case, weren't you? Can you maybe tell us a little bit about that? It's Jefferson Morley versus U.S. government, isn't it, to release a lot of these?
Well, so I've been involved in two lawsuits. The first was a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit for the records of the deceased CIA officer, George Joannides, who was involved in the events of 1963. That lawsuit went on for an incredible 16 years before it was finally dismissed in federal court by Brett Kavanaugh, it turns out. In October 2022, a year ago, I'm also part of a different lawsuit filed by the Mary Farrell Foundation against the Biden administration and the National Archives for failure to implement the JFK Records Act. That's not a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit. It is aimed at obtaining records, but it's more aimed at the administration of the law and the lax enforcement that Biden and the archives are putting on the law. So that is an ongoing matter. Probably go to trial or head towards trial next year. The case probably won't actually go to trial. It'll be decided by an agreement between us and the government before then. But it's intended to put pressure on them and to make them comply with the law and surrender at least some of the records that they're still hanging on to. So that's ongoing in federal court in San Francisco right now.
Wow. Well, good for you anyway. That just shows the weight of your sort of. It's almost like you're reporting on it, and now you're part of the story, right?
Well, yeah, no, and sometimes that's what it takes is to you have to literally make the news by making it an issue in the courts, and once something's in the court, it gains credibility with reporters and, that this is a real thing that's happening. So the lawsuit, people are paying attention to the lawsuit as well. So.
obviously this is an incredibly vast subject matter.
Yeah.
We could talk for days about it. Just before we get started, maybe we could just run through a quick synopsis of what actually happened, just for those who, I'm not saying
Yeah.
we're old, Jeff, but for the younger guys
No,
who
no.
we're trying to get,
Absolutely.
who don't know what
Absolutely.
happened, and maybe weren't even around for the 1992
Right.
Oliver Stone film.
Yeah. So, you want me to recap the
If
assassination itself and I mean, like what happened then, and or
exactly, yeah. Yeah,
okay,
if possible, maybe you could just run through with your own insights, relatively briefly, what happened, just for people who may have been hidden under a rock, whatever it is,
yeah,
and then obviously that what happened after that. Um, just to recap for people that
yeah,
haven't,
yeah. So, so, so for people who don't know about what exactly happened with the assassination of President Kennedy, it's worth just summarizing what happened, a series of bizarre and shocking events. President Kennedy in November 1963 was more than halfway through his first term in office. He'd had a shaky start as president, but had recovered strongly, was doing well in the polls in 1963, and was considered a favorite for re-election in 1964. Um, a time of crisis and tension in the world. The Cold War is at its peak. But Kennedy's resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis, in particular, in 1962, boosted his popularity. And in November 1963, he went to Texas for a political trip. He was looking ahead to the re-election campaign in 1964, and he was traveling with his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, who, of course, was from Texas, and Texas was key to their chances for re-election. So Kennedy goes to Texas. He flies to San Antonio and then to Fort Worth. And then the third stop on his trip is Dallas, where he engages in a motorcade through the heart of the city, in front of friendly crowds. And as the motorcade is ending, passing through a place called Dealey Plaza, a big kind of park-like area on the edge of downtown Boston, shots ring out. And President Kennedy is wounded. Texas Governor Connolly, who's also in the motorcade, is wounded. They are taken to a hospital, and Kennedy dies about 30 minutes later from a fatal head wound. Connolly survives. Governor Connolly survives. So President Kennedy, the youngest president, really first president with kind of star qualities, handsome, funny. The first president who was kind of like a movie star, and more really in some ways the first modern president with the kind of charisma of a Ronald Reagan or a Barack Obama. Kennedy was the forerunner of that political style. Shot down in broad daylight. It's a shocking, terrible event in the history of the country. About 90 minutes later, a man is arrested, Lee Oswald. He's a former Marine, and he is arrested and charged with killing the president. A rifle in his name was found in an office building overlooking the motorcade route. Oswald denied that he had shot the president and said he was a patsy, meaning a victim of being blamed for a crime that others had committed. The next day, when Oswald was being transferred to another jail, he was shot and killed on national television himself by a man named Jack Ruby, the owner of a local nightclub. So the president is shot and killed. That's shocking. And then the assassin, or the accused assassin of the president, is shot and killed on TV. And these are the events that defy easy explanation to this day. Immediately, the White House, the new president, President Johnson, and J. Edgar Hoover decided. J. Edgar Hoover is the director of the FBI. They decide that they have to convince the public that Oswald has acted alone and has no co-conspirators. That's very strange because the investigation of the president's death had barely begun and Oswald had denied the crime. And yet the new president and the chief law enforcement officer were both saying there's nothing to this.
And Jeff, just sorry to interrupt, but that I think it's important to point out that is a fact that they agreed to do that, right? It's not conjecture. Yes. You have a Substack called JFK Facts, which everyone should check out. But one great thing about yourself as a researcher is, as I understand it, you go just by facts. So Anyone
no,
who's
and
watching and says that's Jeff's opinion, no, it's actually documented that they agreed to say there's one gunman and he's to blame for everything. Is that
yeah,
right?
and yeah, we have a memo from an aide to Hoover who describes a conversation where Hoover tells him that, dated November 24th. And we also have memoranda from two aides to Lyndon Johnson, Nicholas Katzenbach and Bill Moyers, saying that that's what Johnson had said, that we have to assure the public that Oswald had no co-conspirators. That's 2 days after the assassination. The president had not even been buried yet. Oswald was dead and had not yet been buried. And these officials decided that this was the answer. Now, they got what they wanted. A year later, or 10 months later, the Warren Commission, appointed by President Johnson, concluded that Oswald had acted alone and he had no co-conspirators. The problem with the official finding, and there were many, but perhaps the biggest problem was the Warren Commission could not identify a motive. If Oswald did this, why did he do this? And Oswald was a leftist, but the Warren Commission found no evidence that that's why he killed the president. He didn't say, I killed the president, out of conviction. And in fact, Oswald's friends and his wife said he sort of liked Kennedy. He thought Kennedy was an ordinary politician, but he particularly liked Kennedy's stand on civil rights, which was unusual for Oswald, a non-college educated white man from the South, had a lot of sympathy for the civil rights movement. But that was the government's story. And over the years, people just didn't believe it. And when they began to study the evidence that had been assembled by the commission, people argued that it just didn't hang together. It didn't make any sense. It didn't make sense logically, forensically. And those doubts have persisted ever since. Now, there's a whole thing where you say, well, those are the conspiracy theories. There's the official story, and then these crazy people came up with conspiracy theories. Ben, that's a total fallacy. The story of the lone gunman, as it was dubbed, that Oswald was a lone gunman, a lone nut, as it often said, is just another theory of what happened on November 22nd, derived on a set of facts. And the lone gunman theory is derived on a set of facts that turn out not to be true. That's based on assurances from the CIA, for example, that we didn't know anything about this guy Oswald before he shot the president. That was a lie. That was a lie that was said under oath to the Warren Commission by two senior CIA officials who said, we only had minimal information. That's a direct quote, minimal information about Oswald. Completely false. The CIA had been watching Oswald for 4 years. They had at least 42 different documents on him. They knew about his politics, his personal life, his travels, his foreign contacts. They had abundant information about the man who supposedly killed the president. That we have only really learned for sure in the past 20 or 30 years, since Oliver Stone's movie came out in 1992. So we are gaining more knowledge about what happened in the assassination slowly. And we've learned a lot since in the past 20 or 30 years. We don't have smoking gun proof of a conspiracy, but we do have very strong evidence that the official story is not true, that Oswald was not the intellectual author of Kennedy's death. He seems to have been involved in somehow. His comment that he was a patsy, implies that he knew some other people were trying to frame him or make him, look like he was responsible. So he clearly knew something about what was going on and was silenced before he could explain himself. So what we have learned over the years is that is the official story is not true. So what did happen? And that part, we still don't have a lot of clarity. What I would say is, after studying this story for a long time and reading everything and talking to lots of people about it, the preponderance of evidence indicates that the president was killed by enemies in his own government who had the ability to make the crime look like something else, like a covert operation. Now, who those people were, we don't know. And I think when we talk about the secrecy in the remaining documents, those remaining documents could shed light on that question of who knew about this, who knew all this about Oswald, and what's their explanation, since what they first told the Warren Commission, that we didn't have any information about this guy, that was a lie. That was a lie under oath. And so that needs to be explained. And the CIA's never explained it. And that's why people are still interested, because we still don't have a good explanation of how the president came to be killed in broad daylight. And no one was ever brought to justice for the crime.
Well, yeah, I think, and I see your book, The Ghost, which is awesome, on the shelf.
Yeah.
I think that's the one about
Yeah.
James Angleton. And I think I read in there, if I'm not mistaken, about the fact that they were studying Oswald since '59. So obviously
Yes.
the assassination happened in '63. This is, and they claimed, as you said, the two gentlemen who at the Warren Commission, that they knew nothing about it, and it's documented fact that they were watching him since '59.
Yeah.
Why do you think? Why do you think
they
that was?
well, they opened the first. I mean, why did they watch him? I mean, it
Yeah.
made sense to watch him because he was 20-year-old ex-Marine who'd had a security clearance. He'd been a radar operator at an air base, a sensitive air base in Japan. And he offered, when he went there, he said he wanted to move to the Soviet Union out of sympathy with communism. And he offered to share military information from his. So it made sense that the CIA was paying attention to him at that point. They opened a file on him in November 1959. They start reading his mail right away, any foreign mail to and from him. They intercept and read letters from his mother to him while he's living in the Soviet Union. So,
and Jeff, that wasn't known. Sorry to interrupt. That wasn't known until quite recently as well, because it's important to make the distinction. A lot of people thought there was a lone gunman because that was the government line way back when. We know so much more now.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
You know, people. I think a lot of people took the statements of the CIA at face value. If the CIA said we didn't know anything about the man who killed the president, people assumed that would be a true statement. Okay, but it wasn't a true statement. They lied. They lied under oath to the Warren Commission. So yes, that's one of the things why doubts have persisted and have even compounded, is because the story we were told originally was demonstrably, without a doubt, beyond a reasonable doubt, false, a lie, a deliberate lie. And we don't have a good explanation of why wouldn't the CIA really cooperate in the investigation of the murder of a president? And and we see they're still not cooperating. Then that law that makes JFK records public, it was passed after Oliver Stone's movie in 1992. And the law said, it was a very strong law. It was a good law. It said all government agencies have to produce and release their JFK records. Now, there may be sensitive information in there. The agencies have the right to withhold whatever information, for 25 years. So that was in 1992. So after 25 years, the law said that except in the rarest of cases, everything should be made public regardless of whether some information was withheld for those first 25 years. That meant that in October 2017, when that law was supposed to go into effect, the question came to President Trump. And the CIA went to Trump and the FBI, and they said, we're not going to release these records. There's 15,000 records that contain sensitive information, and we need to release at least, withhold at least portions of them. Sometimes they would only withhold, one word in a document, or one sentence, but in some documents it's a page, several pages. Anyway, 15,000 documents have to be withheld. That's what the CIA and the FBI tell Trump in 2017. And Trump goes along. Trump, had a lot of rhetoric about the deep state was out to get him and all of that. When it came to the JFK files, Trump gave the deep state everything they wanted. Another 4 years of secrecy. So Trump caves to the CIA's demands and pushes the ball down the road 4 years and says, we'll revisit this in 4 years. So that meant in October 2021, the question fell to the new president, Joe Biden. And Joe Biden did what Trump did. He went along with exactly what the CIA wanted. We've had some releases since then, piecemeal, and some very important information has come out in the past year, and we can talk about that. But even after the end of the Biden and Trump process, the CIA and primarily the CIA, but other government agencies are withholding at least portions of 4,400 documents said to be related to the assassination. So that's the current state of play. Now, what have we learned in the past year? This is where Ben, I think this is where the story is really interesting, and I urge people to pay attention. These don't sound like sensational revelations. I don't have the social security number of the man on the grassy knoll. You know, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm not filling out or arguing for a conspiracy theory. I'm telling you what happened beyond a reasonable doubt, and what we know now that we didn't know then. So one of the most important things is we learned last December a document came out which revealed the existence of a secret internal CIA investigation of JFK's assassination. And it took place in the Miami station of the agency right after the assassination. So in that week, when the country is shocked and reeling from these baffling series of events where Kennedy is killed and his assassin is killed, and the president and the FBI and the Secret Service and the Dallas Police Department and all the national media are saying one guy did this and nobody else is involved. There's complete unanimity publicly.
And that's driven by, as you said earlier, LBJ and
by
Hoover.
Johnson and Hoover.
Yeah.
Inside the CIA, they did not believe the lone gunman theory, not in South Florida. And they immediately set out to investigate not communists, but anti-Castro exiles. And what we got last December was the memo from one of the guys who participated in that investigation. And he said, here are the questions that we were told to go ask our agents. Who was looking for guns and money? Who had the ability to orchestrate an ambush for the sake of provoking an invasion of Cuba? So the CIA itself did not believe the lone gunman theory and actively investigated people known to the CIA for responsibility for the assassination. We didn't know that before. And the second thing is the CIA never shared the results of that investigation. So they didn't confirm the lone gunman theory, at least not as far as we know, and they never shared what they did find with the Warren Commission or with anybody else. So the CIA itself did not accept the lone gunman theory. That's something we just learned in the past year. A second thing that we learned was the identity of the man who was reading Oswald's mail when he was in the Soviet Union. And that had been kept secret for 60 years. And it wasn't kept secret because the man was alive and the CIA needed to protect his, safety. The man had been dead for 30 years. So they were hiding something more sensitive than his identity. They didn't want to come clean about who was involved in reading Oswald's mail, because that looks very bad for them. You were reading this guy's mail and then he up and killed the president.
And then they said, yeah,
we don't know anything about it. Yeah. So we've learned a lot. We've learned important new things in the past year, and lots of information remains secret. So that's the reality on the 60th anniversary. I say that this year, the CIA has won. I mean, they rolled both Trump and Biden. They were able to dictate terms to both presidents, very different presidents. But the CIA got exactly what they wanted on JFK files, which is continuing secrecy and the right to dictate what will be made public and what won't be. So the CIA has won this go around. But as you can see, if the CIA thinks this story is going away, they're terribly mistaken. And they're obviously mistaken, right? Significant new information is coming out and significant information is being hidden. That's the reality on the 60th anniversary. And so I think the coverage this year is going to be much less friendly to the official story than it was on the 50th, because the secrecy is just very suspicious. It's very suspicious. And the longer it goes on, the more suspicious it is.
Yeah, and I mean, I've heard some theories as to why the secrecy, obviously what you've just spoken about, it kind of makes sense as well. If they've done an internal investigation of their own station in Florida, maybe the results of that could be in the documents, do you think? That could be one.
We know a lot about the documents that are withheld, and there's no document matching that description even in the collection of redacted material. This is one of the points about our lawsuit, which is the law, the JFK Records Act law, which was passed unanimously by Congress, including with the approval of then Senator Joe Biden, says that government agencies, when they find new assassination records, have to make them public. And so one of the things that we are trying to do in the lawsuit is make sure that the archives and the president insist to the agencies that if there are new JFK records, that they be produced and made public. And so we are seeking to get, whatever the CIA has on that internal investigation, we're trying to get that into the collection, because that's obviously an important JFK record to have. So, but like I say, the CIA has the upper hand right now because they've got Biden on their side. And the only way to get something out of the CIA is to have the president tell them they've got to do it. There's no other lever on the CIA that works. Only the president can do it.
I guess the CIA would argue something like if the information came out, it could expose sources and methods. And I guess they're still operating around Cuba in certain ways. Yeah, that's one thing. Or maybe also that it could have started a war if they knew that how the involvement perhaps of Russian agents. Maybe that would be their excuse, I guess. Even though I think the perceived wisdom is that the Russians were not involved.
Yeah, I think the agency's explanation of its actions. I mean, it's not credible, and so this doubt persists. They will say this is legitimate national security information. When we look at these documents, we can tell a lot about what's withheld because you can read all the context around it. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times it is sources and methods. It's agreements with the Mexican government, for example. They want to withhold the details. Some of those things are not particularly national security oriented, but are just embarrassing to the CIA. So like one example that they're still withholding, it has nothing to do with JFK. What it has to do with is a CIA official, when he was testifying in the JFK investigation, was asked about certain CIA operations overseas, including an operation to defame the president of Indonesia, who was kind of perceived as a leftist or not an American ally. And so the CIA created a fake porno film to discredit him in a Muslim country. And so in this testimony, the official explains how the CIA goes about making a fake porno film to smear a foreign president. They don't want it to share the details. It's
embarrassing, yeah.
It's not national security information, right? I mean, whatever is under there isn't going to harm the national security of the United States. It's just going to embarrass the CIA.
Right.
Let me get some water.
Sure. Yeah, take your time. I mean, I guess like that's another way the embarrassment factor comes in is with the mafia involvement.
Much better.
Yeah.
So, what are you getting at, or what do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, that it's such a broad, and there's so many rabbit holes you can go down. Yeah. I mean, I was just speaking about the CIA embarrassment. There was a book that I read many years ago called Crossfire by Sam and Chuck Giancana. The mafia guy from Chicago and his brother. So I guess maybe that might be part of it as well. If there's an element of the CIA was working with a mafia, which I don't know your thoughts on this, but they were apparently.
The
that
CIA
might be embarrassing for them as well. Yeah.
The CIA is working with organized crime figures to assassinate Fidel Castro. That story is well known. And that's probably not what's being hidden right now. People ask me, well, what about the involvement of organized crime? Mafia bosses have no ability to keep CIA documents secret today. Okay. So, and since Sam Giancana wrote that book, and his lawyer said, that he thought his Sam Giancana was involved in the assassination, there are some kind of ominous comments made by mafia bosses on surveillance tapes about Kennedy, that sort of thing. But over time, that evidence has not accumulated. It's more kind of dwindled away. And the case for an organized crime conspiracy, never strong. hasn't gotten stronger. I would put it that way. A second thing that I would say is, how does the mafia kill people? The mafia kills people with their hands tied behind their back. They kill them with car bombs. They don't kill them with precision sharpshooting, in an open place. That is much more of a military type activity, not an organized crime activity. So I think that there is an organized crime element to the story because Jack Ruby, the Dallas nightclub owner who killed Lee Harvey Oswald, associated with organized crime figures, idolized organized crime figures. We now know he spoke on the phone with organized crime figures in November 1963. And, so the fact that he silenced the key witness in the assassination indicates somehow organized crime was, indirectly involved, something like that. I'll tell you another story, which is I interviewed a woman who worked for Jack Ruby, who was a dancer in his club. And she had a close friendship with him. He was very sweet on her and even proposed to get married, which she wasn't interested, but they were friends. And her daughter introduced me to her. And so I interviewed her and I said, "Why did your friend Jack kill Oswald?" And she said, "I don't think he had a choice." And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Well, everybody works for somebody, and Jack worked for people. And I don't know who they were, but I think that he didn't have a choice in killing Oswald," which I thought was really interesting and kind of speaks to an organized crime type milieu. She also said that Jack Ruby, she didn't know anything about what he thought about President Kennedy, but he despised Bobby Kennedy. So, you have a motive right there for somebody wanting to silence a key witness.
And then another thing I wanted to ask you about, Jeff, there's this report or a story, I think there was a book called Chaos. Anyway, there was a suggestion that one guy came to visit Jack Ruby in the hospital, and after that, his psychiatric report said that he was insane. And this gentleman that went to visit him was part of the MK Ultra trials. For people who don't know, was to do with using psychedelic drugs, I believe, to send people insane. And they used
So MK Ultra was a CIA program to develop techniques of mind control, to induce amnesia. You could induce amnesia and get somebody to do something they would never remember it, or to interrogate people. Truth serum. They were looking for chemicals that would make people tell the truth. They used psychedelic drugs for, all different kinds of purposes. So MK Ultra was a very big, very destructive program. It was completely uncontrolled. There was a lot of inhumane scientific experiments on unwitting people. It was really a crime spree. And this book that you talk about, Chaos, by a man named Tom McNeil, told a story that had not been known before. And this is one of the important stories that's come out in recent years, that a doctor who worked with the MK Ultra program, doing LSD experiments, had been one of the doctors who was assigned by the courts to visit and assess Ruby's mental state. The question was he crazy when he did this, or not? And this doctor, Dr. Jolly West, they called him, a professor at the University of Oklahoma, visited Ruby and came away and said he's psychotic. None of the other doctors who visited Ruby said that he was psychotic. And so the fact that a doctor with connections to the CIA had played this role in making Ruby look crazy, which, would have the tendency to dampen conspiratorial speculation, right? He wasn't part of a plot. He was just crazy. Nobody's explained why Dr. West was allowed into that jail cell, or, whether he was acting at the behest of the CIA or not. We just don't know. I wouldn't assume too much from it. But again, it's one of those things, the fact that it wasn't disclosed before makes you wonder why, and makes you think they had something to hide.
And then just to backtrack a little bit, or to just come back to kind of a macro 30,000 foot view for a second, for people who are, maybe a lot of people who are new to this and think, you know what, this is all just a load of horse shit. There was a lone gunman, like the government says. there's a lot of evidence, and I just looked at some of the witnesses on the grassy knoll about people who said there were shots fired from the front. So even a police officer who was in the motorcade, he was talking about, yeah, well, the shot came from behind, and then the second shot hit him in the face, but the assassin was in the book depositories.
Right.
So
Yeah,
can
I
you
mean,
maybe talk a bit about what
yeah, so people should understand the president was driving in front of a large crowd. Several hundred people were in the immediate vicinity. They were waving to him. This was the very tail end of the motorcade, and the president was about to get on the freeway and go to his lunch date. So they'd gone through this long parade through downtown Dallas. They'd reached the end of it, and that's when the gunfire rang out. There were people all around there. And so the question was, where did the gunfire come from? Well, there was an office building behind the presidential motorcade, and gunfire clearly came from there because both Kennedy and Connally had wounds in their back. But Kennedy also had a massive wound in his head. And the people in the immediate vicinity of the limousine who were waving when the gunshots rang out, a lot of people in the immediate vicinity said that shots did not just come from behind the limousine, but they came from the front. And in Dealey Plaza, where this shooting took place, there was what the area that's called a grassy knoll. It was dubbed that by a reporter on the scene, and it's a grassy area with a park bench and a parking lot on top of it. And a lot of people said that the shots may have come from behind a stockade fence around that parking lot. And so it's not crazy to think that shots came from there. In fact, the man who coined the term grassy knoll was a newspaper reporter on the scene who immediately went to the hospital following Kennedy and called in a story to his editors at United Press International. And in the story, he said that the Secret Service men thought that gunfire had come from a grassy knoll area to which Secret Service men rushed. Okay, that's why we say the term grassy knoll, because that reporter, Merriman Smith, wrote that less than 30 minutes after the assassination, and he was in the motorcade. So Merriman Smith himself had spoken to Secret Service agents who said the shots came from the front. Now, the Warren Commission never investigated the possibility that shots came from the front. They never asked anybody about it. The witnesses who were the closest to the limousine when the president was killed were not interviewed. Right? They didn't want to know about this. They didn't want to entertain any doubts. So it's not crazy to think that a shot came from the front. I did a piece for my JFK Facts Substack. There were 21 law enforcement officers present at the scene who went to the grassy knoll because they thought that's where the gunshots came from. Okay, so it's not invented. People on the scene, that's what they thought. And the government never investigated. One other thing that we've learned in recent years, and this is very important, this was very influential in my thinking. One of the doctors who tried to save Kennedy's life, Dr. Robert McClellan, gave several interviews to doctors, to other interested medical personnel about his experience trying to save that. And McClellan said very clearly he was called into Trauma Room 1. President Kennedy was brought in on the stretcher, badly wounded, dying. And all the medical personnel were doing all the things they do, cutting off his clothes, putting in a transfusion, trying to save the life of a badly wounded man. Dr. McClellan stood at the head of the table while they were doing it. He was one of the senior doctors on the scene. So he was just watching to make sure everything was done right. And he's standing over Kennedy and he looks down and he sees the wound in Kennedy's head. And he describes a massive blowout wound in the back of the head. And Dr. McClellan said that after he saw the film that was taken of the assassination by a bystander, Abraham Zapruder, based on what he saw looking at Kennedy's wounds from a distance of about 18 inches for 20 minutes, and what he saw on the film of the assassination, made him certain that President Kennedy was killed by a shot from the front. Dr. McClellan had testified to the Warren Commission. It's interesting to read Arlen Specter's very leading testimony to try and get him to say something that will support the lone gunman theory, that the shot came from the back, not the front. Dr. McClellan gave very technical answers, didn't prejudice himself. And later in life, he tells this story that he was certain, and that's the word he used, certain, as a medical professional. It went on to a long, distinguished career, mentor to dozens of doctors at Parkland Hospital, really a beloved figure who died just a couple of years ago. He was quite certain that shots had come from the front. So, this accumulating evidence and the continuing secrecy really, leads me to one conclusion that, whatever happened, it was hidden and obfuscated by people high in the government because there was something about the story that couldn't be told publicly. And that's still the case.
Yep. I mean, we could talk about that all for ages. But I mean, I guess while we're talking about the hospital, there was this new revelation from one of the Secret Service agents, Mr. Landis, there was the mystery of the bullet that appeared in pristine condition after causing 7 wounds on 2 men on the gurney. And maybe you could address that. Your thoughts on that?
Another recent revelation is Paul Landis, who was a Secret Service agent in the motorcade that day. He was assigned to give protection to First Lady Jackie Kennedy. Came forward with a book, which was just published last week, in which he said that after the assassination, when the president's car was taken to the hospital, he looked in the limousine and he found a bullet in the back seat of the limousine in near pristine condition. And he took this bullet and he went inside and he put it on the gurney where the president lay because he wanted people to know about it somehow. Mm-hmm. Now, if the story is true, that Landis did find a bullet there, then the Warren Commission is wrong. It's that simple. The question is Landis right? And Landis has told his story about what happened that day in many different ways over the years, which undermines his credibility. Now, he has an explanation for that, which is basically PTSD and embarrassment and shame because he acted unprofessionally, but he's trying to come clean. Psychologically, that seems plausible, but I because of the problems with his story, I can't take his account as decisive.
Mm-hmm. And then
I would say this: it further undermines the official theory. I mean, mm-hmm. He describes a chaotic crime scene. There are other witnesses who corroborate aspects of his story. So what he's saying may well be true. There's a nurse who said, I saw, and she said this 10 years ago, long before Landis ever told this story. She said, I saw a near pristine bullet on President Kennedy's stretcher. And I was struck by the fact that it was pristine. She had seen a lot of gunshot wounds and bullets. So her story is consistent with Landis's story. So mm-hmm. Landis's story might be true. At a minimum, it introduces more doubt to the official story. And Landis himself said on November 22nd, or shortly after November 22nd, that he thought a shot came from the front. Another law enforcement officer who thought a shot came from the front.
A member of the Secret Service. Yeah, that's really important, I think. And like I think you kind of already said this, but if that was that means that there had to have been more shots fired, because if there's one, if that accounts for that, so we can go into this all day. I guess the next question is, or the next sort of subject that might be interesting to cover is just about Oswald himself, because obviously if you think about, we're not saying this is a mafia hit, but when there's a mafia or an organized crime assassination, yes, there's the guy at the bottom of the rung who's done the crime, but then there's all this network of above, and they're the untouchables. They're the guys that really were the shot callers. Just for people that are new to this, Oswald defected to the Soviet Union. I guess can you maybe just talk about the narrative or the perceived idea as to why he did that? And I think the idea that you've written in your books is, as I understand it, is that he was sent as a bait for the KGB as a double agent. Would that be right? Or
we don't know that for sure. Was Oswald what they call a false defector? You send somebody over there pretending to be a defector so that he can get information out. It's possible that that's what Oswald was, given the close attention that they paid to him. But we can't be sure of that, and I wouldn't assume it, and I don't state it as fact. What we do know is that as soon as Oswald went to Moscow, he was 20 years old. He said, I'm a communist. I want to live in the Soviet Union. I'll share military secrets with you. the CIA and the State Department is informed about this, and they inform the CIA that there's this American defector. And Oswald is then given entry, and the Soviets get him a job in Minsk, which was then part of the Soviet Union. And he goes and works in a radio factory there and hangs out with young Russian students, university students, and young people. He lives there from October 1959 to March 1962, a little more than 2 years. He meets and marries a Russian woman there, Marina Prusakova, and has a child with her. But he's stifled by the Soviet Union, by the realities of communism, very conformist, very tightly controlled. And he wants to go back. So in March 1962, Oswald returns to the United States, and he and Marina move back to Texas, and he lives there. Now, normally, when somebody like Oswald did that, they would be turned over to the FBI. The FBI does domestic counterintelligence. The CIA is not supposed to have any role on U.S. soil. But in the case of Oswald, the CIA does not lose interest in him. In fact, they maintain their interest, and they make sure they get everything that the FBI has on Oswald is routed to James Angleton, chief of counterintelligence for the CIA, one of the most powerful men in the agency, and the man who controlled the file on Lee Harvey Oswald from 1959 to 1963. So Oswald goes to the Soviet Union out of sympathy for communism, becomes disillusioned, comes home, and the CIA, stays interested in him. That background is so unusual. That's another thing, like, this guy who's so closely watched by the CIA is the one who killed the president. How is that possible? And the CIA said, "Oh, we didn't know anything about him." That we now know, to repeat, is a lie. I mean, they knew a lot about him. I can't emphasize that enough. So they were in a position to manipulate him because they knew how. When you manipulate somebody in covert action work, when the CIA does that, they really study what is your motivation? Why do you do things? How can we get you to do what we want you to do? Well, when you have a thick file on somebody and you know about their personal life, you read, they were reading letters from Oswald's mother to him. They were really interested in the details of his life, and you don't do that for no reason, right? You do that because it's going to help you do an operation at some point. So that's what's going on with Oswald. And so his defection to the Soviet Union, there's a lot of speculation about, was he a false defector? It's possible. We don't have evidence of it. There's some kind of circumstance. You could make a case for it. You can argue for it. But I don't assert it as truth. What we know is plenty. They kept very close track of him while he went to the Soviet Union and after he came back, right up until the week that Kennedy left to go to Texas. Angleton's aide signed for 2 FBI reports on Oswald on November 14th and 15th of 1963. So they had the latest information from the FBI, which was all about he'd been arrested, he'd gone to Mexico, he beat his wife. I mean, again, very detailed information sitting on the desk of the CIA while JFK is alive.
Wow. So, such a tangled web, as it were.
Yeah, I want to push back against this is incredibly complicated and we'll never understand it and all of that. That's not true. It's very complicated. It's shrouded in official secrecy, but the story is knowable, comprehensible, and we are narrowing it down. We are getting a clearer picture of CIA misconduct around Lee Harvey Oswald. That's the gist of the story. That's not complicated, and it's not open for dispute. The story that they lied to the Warren Commission, have any lone gunman advocate on your show and ask them, is this true? And they'll have to admit they lied to the Warren Commission about what they knew about Oswald. So what I'm saying is not impossibly complicated. It's not subject to a lot of uncertainty. It doesn't solve the crime, but everything I'm telling you is absolutely irrefutably true.
The next question, I guess, would be about the motive. Why would the CIA or the Pentagon or whoever was handling and controlling Oswald, what would be their motivation to kill Kennedy? Would this be as a result of the Bay of Pigs or a false flag that they want to cause an invasion?
I'm not saying that anyone was controlling Oswald. Okay, I'm not. That's not my premise. I don't work from that assumption. Again, I'm going to tell you what we know for sure. Kennedy's policies on Cuba, especially, provoked bitter feelings, both in South Florida, where the enemies of Fidel Castro had gathered in exile, and also in the upper ranks of the CIA and the Pentagon. And Kennedy's policies were not merely regarded as weak, they were regarded as threatening. And Kennedy's policy in Cuba, particularly, refusing to get involved, refusing to overthrow the government of Fidel Castro the way the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the CIA wanted him to do, that was, that's a reality. Kennedy was hated in 1963. People don't remember this. In a lot of places when Kennedy was assassination was announced, there was cheering in public schools. People were happy Kennedy was dead. That was a lot around his stand on civil rights, but Cuba was also very important in that. So the bitter feelings that were present, especially among CIA and officers and CIA assets in Miami, was very profound. And that's why the CIA station in Miami investigated Cuban exiles for the assassination, because they were the most likely suspects.
Now, just finally, do you think, with regards to Oswald, do you think he fired any bullets? Because there are some who argue that there was no sort of forensic evidence to suggest he fired any gun.
They did a paraffin test on Oswald's face. If you fire a gun like that, some of the material comes out and sticks to your skin. The paraffin test was not positive for Oswald, indicating that it didn't prove that he had fired a weapon that day. And the fingerprints that were found on the stock of the barrel, the Dallas police officer who took those fingerprints said they were not fresh, that they were not from that day. So there is forensic reason to doubt that Oswald fired that weapon. We don't know exactly where Oswald was. I think the evidence is that he was not on the 6th floor when the shots were fired. I think that it's possible he could have been. So he might have fired a shot. And, I'll concede that for the sake of the argument. I don't think that's the primary question. Oswald clearly knew something was up that day, and he might have had a real hand in it. But I think that if you take all the evidence together, Oswald's not the only person firing a gun at the president.
And then to what extent do you think LBJ might have been aware of this prior to the assassination?
As the person who benefits the most, people always focus on LBJ. I don't see anything in the public record that indicates that Johnson knew that this was happening. I see a lot that indicates he knew exactly what had happened, when it happened. And that comment that he makes to Nicholas Katzenbach, the Deputy Attorney General, and Bill Moyers, the press secretary, on 2 days after the assassination, where he says, we have to assure the public that Oswald acted alone. That seems like the actions of a guy who doesn't want an investigation, who doesn't want to know. And so, I think that's what tells you, Johnson knew that there was something to hide. Did he have foreknowledge? The stories that are told about that come from witnesses whose credibility is really open to question. It's not strong evidence at all. So I discount that LBJ was involved in a conspiracy to kill the president. I think he knew that the president had been killed by enemies in his own government, and Johnson did not want to investigate them. He wanted to be president. He didn't want to tear his government apart.
The other thing I was thinking about was just after looking at some of the footage from the day, there was the Dallas police parading Oswald and him announcing to the press that he was a patsy and that he didn't shoot anyone. I was wondering if that might be in part the police having questioned him and him maybe possibly spilling the beans to some extent to save his own skin. Maybe even, disclosing classified information and then them saying, let's put him in front of the press because it sounds like he might be innocent. Do you think there's any credence to that?
I don't think that's the case. I mean, Oswald was interrogated by FBI agents and Dallas police detectives. We don't have a recording of that interrogation, which is shocking under the circumstances because they did have recording equipment and they did record interviews with criminal suspects at that time. So we have the notes of various people who were in the room. Oswald did not disclose classified information. He lied clearly on some points. Uh, so, and I think they brought him out just because the country was reeling and needed some explanation. I don't think that they thought he was going to say that to the TV cameras. I'm a patsy. You know, that put that comment alone put the government in a very difficult situation because that implied that if Oswald came to trial, he was going to talk about other people. And that's exactly what Hoover and Johnson were against. And as soon as Oswald was dead, they said, we have to assure the public that that dead guy did it and nobody was helping him. I mean, think about it, Ben. Just that alone tells you how people were thinking about this. They did not want to know. They wanted to blame it all on the conveniently dead guy. That was easier for everybody concerned. And so that's what happened.
And what are you hoping for in the final release? And when can we expect that, if at all?
The CIA has won. The documents that they are keeping secret, they can keep secret indefinitely, and it's no longer up to the president. Biden basically handed over that authority to the CIA to determine when these JFK records will be released. So there's no date set. Really, I mean, Biden gutted the JFK Records Act. The whole point of the JFK Records Act was that the president would oversee the orderly review and release of assassination related records. That process is no longer in effect. Now we have the process is not controlled by the White House. The process is controlled by the CIA. So these documents are not going to become public anytime soon. What do I expect? I mean, I think that we've learned a lot from what has come out recently. And what's really important is for people to understand how the meaning of what we have learned in the past 20 years and also in the past year, which show that this story about the lone gunman, it wasn't even believed at the CIA. And there's no compelling reason to believe it today, and that we need a better explanation. So I'm looking for new information. I think I continue to report on this. I'm going to have a story this week about a dimension of the story that people didn't know before about the CIA and Oswald. So, this is a live story. Biden issued a big order about it. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is talking about it. Trump is talking about it. So this is something that's in the national political agenda, not big, but an enduring kind of symbolic issue that people come back to, again and again and again, because they're not satisfied with what they know.
Well, Jeff, that was amazing. Thank you so much for that. Where can people see that report? You mentioned something new would be coming out from yourself. Would that be on your Substack,
the
JFK Facts?
Substack, which you can get subscribe for free, and you get some of the content, or $5 a month, you get all of it, and original reporting, factual, no conspiracy theories about what's the real record of the assassination of President Kennedy. This is the place to come if you want to know more about this story as it emerges in the weeks and months and years to come.
Great. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for that. I really do appreciate it.
Thanks so much to Jeff for that. That was an amazing chat with him about this crazy topic that seems to go on and on. Please check out his Substack, jfkfacts.substack.com, and check out his books, The Ghost, about James Angleton. That's a great one. Our Man in Mexico, and Scorpion's Dance. Thanks so much to Jeff. Check him out. And while you're there, please give me a 5-star review or whatever you can to keep the algo going. Thanks, guys.